Some people think a property line is just a line on paper. They don't realize it can decide who loses everything. The scream of a chainsaw ripped through the quiet before my coffee had even finished brewing. It wasn't the gentle buzz of someone trimming branches for spring. It was deep, angry, the kind of mechanical roar that echoes through your chest before your brain catches up. I froze with my mug halfway to my lips as the smell of fresh-cut oak drifted through the open kitchen window. Then came the second sound, the heavy crack of old wood giving way under steel teeth. I stepped onto my back porch and felt cool morning air hit my face. Sunlight filtered through the canopy that had shaded this yard for longer than I'd been alive. At least, it had until 5 men in neon safety vests surrounded the first massive white oak with orange paint circling its trunk. One of them lifted the chainsaw again. "Hold it," I shouted as I crossed the lawn. The engine idled down, but nobody looked surprised to see me. Instead, a familiar voice floated across the yard before I even reached them. "Good morning, Ethan." Linda Brooks stood beside a white HOA SUV with both hands folded neatly over a clipboard. Crisp white blouse. Designer sunglasses. Perfect blonde hair that somehow never moved, even when the wind picked up. She smiled the same way insurance companies deny claims, with absolute confidence. I was beginning to wonder when you'd wake up. "What are they doing?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. She adjusted her sunglasses and pointed toward the trees. "Removing hazardous growth. You've ignored multiple notices about these untrimmed trees. They're encroaching on HOA common property." I stared at her for a second before looking back at the nearest oak. Encroaching. That tree had been standing there since my grandfather planted it over 40 years ago. Its roots had survived droughts, storms, lightning strikes, and every season this valley had thrown at it. Apparently, the only thing truly dangerous was an HOA president with a clipboard. "I never authorized anyone to touch these trees." "You don't have to." Her smile widened. "The board already approved the work." One of the workers shifted awkwardly beside the trunk. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "Should we wait?" Linda never took her eyes off me. "No. Continue." The chainsaw screamed back to life. That was when I noticed the orange survey flags scattered through my backyard. Not my survey flags. Theirs. Cheap plastic stakes pushed into the soil as if someone had redrawn my property overnight. I walked toward the nearest one and pulled it from the ground. The thin wire bent easily between my fingers. "This marker doesn't belong here." Linda shrugged. "Our surveyor disagrees." "Our surveyor." Interesting choice of words. Not the county. Not the deed office. Not a licensed boundary determination. Just their surveyor. She stepped closer and handed me a bright yellow envelope. "Since you've refused to maintain your trees, the HOA is issuing a daily violation beginning today. You'll also be responsible for the removal costs." The paper still smelled warm from the printer. $500. Then another 100 every single day after that. I looked from the notice, to the chainsaw, to Linda's satisfied expression. She expected me to argue. She expected me to panic. She expected me to lose my temper in front of a dozen neighbors who had quietly gathered at the sidewalk, pretending to walk their dogs while waiting for the morning entertainment. Instead, I folded the notice once, then twice, slipped it calmly into my back pocket, and smiled, because 20 feet away, those ancient oaks weren't the only things with deep roots. Buried beneath this property was something Linda Brooks had never imagined. A survey report my late father sealed away years before Willow Creek Estates even existed. And before this week was over, that forgotten report was going to move a lot more than a few trees. The chainsaw finally went silent, but the smell of fresh cut wood lingered in the air long after the crew packed up their equipment. They hadn't taken down the first oak. Not yet. They'd only trimmed a few lower branches before I convinced the foreman to pause until the county could verify the property line. Linda rolled her eyes before climbing into her SUV, probably convinced she'd be back tomorrow to finish the job. She had no idea she'd just awakened memories that had been buried deeper than the roots beneath those trees. I stood alone beneath the largest white oak, running my hand across its rough bark. The grooves felt exactly the way they had when I was 10 years old. Back then, this wasn't just another tree. It was where my father taught me that every piece of land tells a story if you're patient enough to read it. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 41 years old, and for the last 18 years I've worked as a civil engineer, designing bridges, drainage systems, and county infrastructure across Central Texas. My job revolves around measurements. Inches matter. Elevations matter. Property lines matter. People assume engineers see land as numbers. My father taught me to see memories instead. This house has belonged to my family since 1979, when my grandfather bought 12 quiet acres long before anyone imagined turning these rolling hills into a subdivision full of matching mailboxes and HOA meetings. He planted the row of white oaks with his own hands during the first spring after moving here. Dad used to joke that Grandpa trusted trees more than fences. Fences can be moved, he'd say while wiping dirt from his hands. Trees remember where they started. Every Saturday morning, Dad and I walked the property together. The smell of damp soil mixed with cedar after every rain. We'd stop beside each oak while he pointed toward tiny brass survey monuments buried flush with the ground. Never lose track of these, he'd tell me. At the time, they looked like ordinary pieces of metal hidden beneath weeds. Years later, I realized they were worth more than gold. Dad wasn't just a survey enthusiast. Before becoming a county engineering consultant, he'd spent nearly 2 decades working alongside licensed land surveyors. He believed paperwork meant nothing unless it matched the earth beneath your boots. Maps lie, he always said. The ground doesn't. When Willow Creek Estates started expanding 15 years ago, developers knocked on our door 3 different times asking to buy the back portion of our property. Grandpa had already passed by then, but Dad turned every offer down without hesitation. They'll keep coming, he told me one evening while we watched the sunset through those same oak branches. They don't want the trees. They want what's underneath them. At the time, I assumed he meant the land itself. I didn't understand there was something else hidden beneath those roots. After Dad passed away 3 years ago, I inherited the house exactly as he'd left it. Same worn workshop. Same rusted toolbox sitting beneath the workbench. Same heavy fireproof safe tucked into the corner of the basement where he stored every deed, every plat map, every faded notebook he'd filled over 4 decades. I never opened most of them. Life got busy. Projects piled up. The safe stayed locked. Until Linda Brooks decided my grandfather's trees suddenly belonged to the HOA. Standing beneath their branches that morning, listening to the wind whisper through leaves my family had planted decades earlier, I realized something that made my pulse slow instead of race. Linda believed she was fighting over trees. I knew my father had spent his entire life protecting something far more valuable. If you've ever lived in an HOA neighborhood, you already know there are 2 kinds of presidents. The volunteers who quietly keep the lights on, and the ones who mistake a clipboard for a crown. Linda Brooks belonged to the second group. You could hear her before you saw her. The slow hum of her white Lexus SUV creeping through the subdivision every morning at exactly 8:15. She never drove with a purpose. She patrolled. Windows cracked just enough for her expensive perfume to drift into the warm Texas air while her eyes scanned every mailbox, every flower bed, every driveway like a prison guard searching for contraband. People waved. Linda never waved back. She inspected. The first week after I moved back into my father's house full-time, she introduced herself without so much as asking my name. "You'll need to repaint that mailbox," she said, tapping the wooden post with a manicured fingernail. "It's 2 shades darker than the approved color." I looked at the faded box my father had built by hand nearly 20 years earlier. "It's brown. It's the wrong brown." That pretty much summed up Linda Brooks. She'd spent 6 years as president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association after a successful career selling luxury homes across the county. She loved talking about property values as if she'd invented real estate itself. Every conversation somehow circled back to curb appeal, community standards, or resale potential. The neighborhood wasn't bad. Most families kept to themselves. Kids rode bicycles after school. Couples walked their dogs at sunset. Retirees watered flower beds while country music drifted from open garages. Then Linda would drive past. Conversations stopped. People suddenly remembered somewhere else they needed to be. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like neighbors avoiding eye contact. I learned quickly that everyone had a Linda story. Mrs. Carter across the street received 3 violation letters because her grandson left a basketball hoop in the driveway during summer vacation. The Reynolds family spent nearly $2,000 replacing a perfectly good cedar fence because Linda claimed the stain wasn't listed on the HOA's approved color chart. Old Mr. Jenkins, a 78-year-old widower who could barely walk without a cane, was fined repeatedly because autumn leaves from trees outside his property blew across his lawn before he could rake them. Nobody fought back. It was easier to pay, easier to apologize, easier to pretend Linda was simply doing her job. But there was something different whenever she looked toward my property. She didn't see maintenance violations. She saw opportunity. One afternoon, I caught her standing near my back fence with two board members I'd never met before. They weren't looking at the trees. They were pointing at the strip of land running behind them. The same narrow section where every one of my grandfather's white oaks stood in a perfectly straight line. I watched from my workshop window while they unfolded what looked like an oversized subdivision map across the hood of Linda's SUV. She traced something with her finger. The others nodded. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile she'd worn while handing me violation notices. This one was different. Satisfied. Calculated. Like someone who believed she'd already won. The next HOA newsletter arrived 3 days later. Most homeowners probably skipped right over page 4. I didn't. Buried beneath announcements about the community picnic and pool maintenance was a small paragraph titled Future Greenbelt Enhancement Project. The proposal mentioned expanding common landscaping along the eastern boundary of the neighborhood. My eastern boundary. It promised walking paths, decorative lighting, irrigation upgrades, and additional native trees to improve neighborhood aesthetics. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Nowhere did it mention acquiring private land. Nowhere did it explain how they intended to build a greenbelt where my family's trees had stood for 4 decades. But as I folded the newsletter, one sentence from my father echoed in my head. They won't ask for the land, Ethan. They'll convince everyone it was theirs all along. The violations didn't come all at once. They came like steady drops of water against stone, small enough to ignore at first, relentless enough to wear you down if you let them. 3 days after the chainsaw crew left, another yellow envelope appeared in my mailbox. Violation number 2. Failure to maintain vegetation. Daily fine increased to $600. The paper was neatly folded, signed by Linda Brooks, and sealed with the HOA's blue logo as if it were an official court order instead of a letter from a neighborhood committee. I carried it into the house without opening it again. By Friday, another one arrived. Then another the following Monday. Every envelope looked identical. Every accusation grew more confident. The trees were now described as a continuing hazard to community property. Community property. I read that phrase 3 times before setting the notice on my kitchen table. Words matter. As an engineer, I'd spent my career reading contracts where a single sentence could determine millions of dollars in liability. Linda wasn't choosing these phrases by accident. Someone wanted a paper trail that suggested the HOA had always considered that strip of land its responsibility. Someone was building a case. Outside, the subdivision kept moving as if nothing unusual was happening. School buses stopped every morning. Sprinklers hissed across perfectly trimmed lawns before sunrise. The scent of fresh-cut Bermuda grass drifted through the neighborhood almost every afternoon. Yet every time I stepped into my backyard, I found something new. One morning, it was another row of orange survey flags. The next day, someone had tied bright pink ribbons around 3 of my grandfather's oaks. Then came white spray paint marking circles near the base of each trunk. Professional logging marks. I knelt beside one of the painted circles and rubbed my thumb across the bark. The paint was still tacky. They weren't threatening anymore. They were preparing. Late that afternoon, I drove past the county records office on my way home from a bridge inspection project. I almost pulled into the parking lot. Almost. Instead, I kept driving. Not because I was giving up. Because my father had taught me something else. Never show your hand until you know every card on the table. If Linda was creating documentation, I wanted to know exactly how far she planned to go before I interrupted her. That answer came sooner than I expected. Saturday morning, my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, knocked gently on my front door holding a folded flyer. "I thought you should see this," she whispered. The paper announced an emergency HOA board meeting. Agenda Item 3. Approval of Greenbelt expansion along the eastern common area. Estimated construction start. 2 weeks. I looked at the simple neighborhood map printed beneath the agenda. A thick green line stretched across what the HOA labeled as common property. Right through my trees. Mrs. Carter lowered her voice. "Linda told everyone you've already agreed." I looked up. "I'm sorry, what?" She said the county confirmed those trees aren't really yours. For a moment, I didn't answer. The afternoon breeze pushed oak leaves across the porch, while somewhere down the street children laughed as they chased each other with water balloons. Normal life, completely unaware that a lie was quietly spreading from mailbox to mailbox. I thanked Mrs. Carter and watched her walk back across the street. Then I unfolded the flyer again. There it was. Not hidden, not subtle. A full-color rendering of a future walking trail winding gracefully beneath mature white oak trees. My white oak trees, complete with decorative benches, flower beds, and stone signs welcoming residents to the Willow Creek Greenbelt. They hadn't built a single foot of it, but they'd already printed the picture. Standing there with the flyer in my hands, I finally understood what my father had tried to warn me about years earlier. Linda Brooks wasn't trying to trim a few branches. She was trying to make an entire neighborhood believe my family's land had belonged to someone else all along. And the more paperwork she created, the harder that lie would become to erase. Monday morning began with rain. Not a storm, just a slow, steady drizzle that darkened the bark of my grandfather's white oaks and filled the air with the earthy scent of wet leaves. Water collected in the grooves of the old trunks before dripping quietly onto the grass below. Standing on the back porch with a cup of black coffee, I watched the line of trees disappear into the mist. For a moment, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it had when I was a kid. Then my phone buzzed. Another email from the HOA. Final notice before enforcement action. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I watched a pair of cardinals land on one of the lower branches Linda wanted removed. They had built a nest there every spring for as long as I could remember. People often think conflicts begin with shouting. The dangerous ones begin with paperwork. By noon, curiosity finally got the better of me. The email contained 4 attachments: violation history, updated fine schedule, a contractor estimate for tree removal, and something new, a digital map titled Eastern Common Area Maintenance Plan. I zoomed in. The green shaded area extended several feet beyond the HOA fence line and covered nearly every one of my grandfather's oaks. There was no uncertainty in the drawing, no dotted lines, no note saying subject to survey. Whoever made that map had already decided where my property ended. The problem was, I knew maps could be wrong, especially when someone wanted them to be. That afternoon, I drove to my office instead of going home. Most of my coworkers had already left for field inspections, leaving the engineering department unusually quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while rain tapped against the windows. I opened our county GIS database. Parcel boundaries, aerial imagery, historical overlays. Nothing definitive. The digital property layer showed the same line the HOA was using. But I knew enough about GIS systems to recognize one critical disclaimer printed in tiny gray letters at the bottom of the screen. Not to be used for legal boundary determination. There it was. The first crack. The county itself admitted those maps weren't legally binding. I leaned back in my chair. Linda either didn't know the difference, or she was counting on nobody else knowing it. I printed the aerial images anyway and spread them across my desk. Then I pulled out an old photograph from my wallet. It was faded around the edges. Dad and I were standing beneath the largest oak when I was about 11 years old. Behind us, barely visible through the grass, was a short metal survey rod with a weathered orange cap. I compared the photograph to the satellite image. Something felt off. The tree hadn't moved. Trees don't move. Yet the digital property line now passed several feet west of where that survey rod had clearly stood. I grabbed a ruler, measured again, then again. 8 feet. Almost exactly 8 feet. Too much to be a drafting error. Too little for anyone to notice without looking carefully. A slow chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain outside. If the digital maps were shifted by 8 feet, then every improvement the HOA planned to build, every sidewalk, every sprinkler line, every decorative flower bed, would sit exactly where my family had owned land for decades. I folded the photograph carefully and slipped it back into my wallet. Dad's voice echoed in my memory. Never argue with assumptions, Ethan. Find the monument. I closed my laptop, turned off the office lights, and headed for home. For the first time since Linda's chainsaw crew appeared, I wasn't wondering whether the HOA was wrong. I was beginning to suspect they had been standing on my family's land for years without ever realizing it. The basement always smelled the same. Old cedar, machine oil, dust, and paper that had been waiting decades for someone to unfold it. I hadn't been down there in months. The single pull chain clicked, and a lone bulb flooded the room with warm yellow light, casting long shadows across my father's workbench. Every tool was still exactly where he'd left it, the level hanging above the vise. The steel tape measure curled beside a coffee-stained notebook. Even his old survey boots sat beneath the bench, coated with dried Texas clay that no one had bothered to clean. Some people call it clutter. To me, it was a map of the man who raised me. The fireproof safe stood in the far corner, dull gray beneath a layer of dust. I knelt in front of it and hesitated. It had been 3 years since the funeral. 3 years since I'd spun that combination lock. The dial turned with a familiar metallic click. 22. 41. 7. The heavy door released with a soft thud. Inside were dozens of neatly labeled folders stacked with the kind of precision only my father could appreciate. Tax records, original deed, utility easements, boundary surveys. I reached for the last one. The folder was thicker than I expected. When I opened it, a folded plat map nearly 3 feet wide slid onto the workbench. Yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, it displayed every boundary of our property long before Willow Creek Estates existed. Handwritten notes covered the margins in Dad's careful block lettering. Iron pin set. Oak reference. Creek monument. Bearing verified. Every measurement was dated. Every correction initialed. Beneath the map rested a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. For Ethan. Only if the property line is ever questioned. I stared at the handwriting for several seconds before breaking the seal. Inside was a single letter. It wasn't long. If you're reading this, someone has decided paper is more important than the ground. Beneath their feet. Remember what I taught you. Never argue over opinions. Find the monuments. The truth is buried exactly where we left it. My throat tightened. Beneath the letter was another document. A certified boundary survey bearing the county surveyor's seal and my father's signature as consulting engineer. Issue date. 26 years earlier. Attached to it were photographs. Actual photographs. Each one showed freshly installed brass survey monuments before the subdivision had even been approved. The date stamps predated every house Linda Brooks claimed represented the HOA. I spread the photographs across the workbench. One image stopped me cold. Behind my father stood the largest white oak. Its trunk was smaller then, but unmistakable. At its base sat a brass monument with fluorescent orange paint surrounding it. The exact marker I'd remembered from the old family picture. On the back of the photograph, Dad had written 6 simple words. Primary northeast property corner. Do not disturb. I looked back at the plat, then at the photograph, then at the GIS printout I'd brought home from work. The difference wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't a few inches. It wasn't survey tolerance. The digital boundary the HOA relied on had shifted almost 8 feet west of the actual monument. 8 feet. Enough to place every one of my grandfather's trees inside what Linda believed was HOA property. Enough to justify her entire Greenbelt project. Enough to fool anyone who never bothered to verify the original survey. I reached deeper into the folder. More evidence. Receipts from licensed survey crews. County correspondence. Original subdivision review comments. Then, at the very bottom, I found a business card held in place by a rusted paperclip. Daniel Mercer. Licensed professional land surveyor. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. Daniel Mercer. Dad's closest friend. The man who had helped set these very monuments decades ago. If anyone still knew where the truth was buried, it was him. For the first time since Linda Brooks stepped onto my property with a chainsaw crew, I stopped thinking about defending my land. Instead, I began thinking about something much more dangerous. How to let Linda keep digging until she buried herself with her own evidence. Daniel Mercer answered on the second ring. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years, yet he recognized my voice before I even finished introducing myself. Ethan, there was a brief pause. Your father's kid. I was beginning to wonder when you'd finally call. I leaned against the workbench, the old survey documents spread across the table beneath the basement light. You knew this day was coming? A quiet chuckle drifted through the phone. No, I just knew your father. He asked me one question. Have they started claiming the trees? I looked down at the photograph showing the brass monument beside the largest oak. Yes, I figured. Daniel sighed. Meet me tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. Don't bring a lawyer. What should I bring? Work gloves. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. When I pulled into my driveway before sunrise the next morning, Daniel's dusty pickup truck was already parked beside the road. Time had added gray hair and deeper wrinkles to his face, but his handshake was exactly the same. Firm, steady, and practical. He didn't waste time talking. Instead, he walked straight toward the line of white oaks carrying a worn metal detector, a survey shovel, and a weathered field notebook. "The monument's still here," he said confidently. "It has to be." We stopped beneath the largest tree. Morning dew soaked the grass while mockingbirds chirped somewhere high above us. Daniel switched on the detector. A slow electronic hum filled the quiet yard. He moved methodically across the ground. Left, right, forward. Nothing. Another few feet. Still nothing. Then, a sharp metallic tone cut through the morning. "There you are." He smiled. Using the narrow shovel, he carefully peeled back a layer of soil no more than 3 inches deep. Dark earth gave way to compacted gravel. Then brass. Round. Weathered. Exactly where my father had documented it 26 years earlier. Daniel brushed away the dirt with his gloved hand. The survey cap was still stamped with the original registration number. "It never moved," he said. I knelt beside him. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The brass marker wasn't impressive. It wasn't large. It wasn't beautiful. But legally, it mattered more than every HOA newsletter, every violation letter, every digital parcel map Linda had ever printed. Monuments controlled boundaries, not assumptions. Daniel opened his notebook and compared the registration number against records he'd copied decades earlier. Perfect match. Then he stood. "We're not done." Over the next 3 hours, we located 3 more original survey monuments hidden beneath layers of grass, mulch, and years of landscaping. Every one matched the original plat. Every one confirmed the same thing. The boundary hadn't shifted. People had. Around mid-morning, a white SUV slowed to a stop across the street. Linda. She stayed inside the vehicle, sunglasses hiding her eyes, phone pressed against her ear as she watched us work. She never got out. She didn't need to. She was trying to figure out why an 80-year-old surveyor and a civil engineer were digging tiny holes instead of arguing with the HOA. Daniel noticed her immediately. "Good," he whispered. "Let her watch." Instead of confronting her, we continued documenting every monument with photographs, GPS coordinates, elevation notes, and time-stamped measurements. No speeches, no accusations, just evidence. Exactly the way my father had taught us. Before leaving, Daniel handed me a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a survey. Not yet. It was a work order. Official. Signed. Licensed. Boundary retracement survey scheduled. Friday, 8 a.m. County recognized procedures. Certified equipment. Complete monument verification. He smiled as he climbed into his truck. "Don't stop the HOA." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "If Linda wants to send more violation letters." He shrugged. "Let her. If she wants contractors, let them schedule. If she wants another board meeting, smile and thank her." I looked toward the white SUV still parked across the street. "What?" Daniel rested one arm on the truck door before answering. "Because every letter she signs is another document proving she knowingly claimed land that wasn't hers." He started the engine. "And once the survey is complete," he glanced toward the line of ancient white oaks swaying quietly in the breeze. "Those papers won't protect her. They'll bury her." Friday arrived with the kind of crystal-clear morning that surveyors love. The sky stretched cloudless above Willow Creek Estates, and the first rays of sunlight glinted off dew-covered grass like thousands of tiny mirrors. By 7:30, my driveway was already filling with trucks carrying county survey equipment. Tripods, GPS receivers, robotic total stations, bright orange cases stamped with county inventory numbers. There was nothing dramatic about the machines themselves. To most people, they looked like expensive cameras. To me, they looked like the beginning of the truth. Daniel Mercer climbed out of the lead truck wearing the same faded field hat I'd seen him wear 20 years earlier. Only this time he wasn't alone. 2 licensed surveyors, a county engineering technician, and a representative from the county planning office accompanied him. Everything was official. Everything was documented. Across the street, curtains began to move. Garage doors opened one after another. Neighbors wandered on his sidewalks holding coffee mugs, pretending they were simply enjoying the weather. No one wanted to admit they were there to watch. At exactly 8 o'clock, another white SUV rolled into the neighborhood. Linda Brooks. She stepped out wearing a navy blazer despite the growing heat, carrying a thick binder against her chest. Behind her came two HOA board members and the association's attorney. Linda smiled the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Ethan. I hope you're ready to settle this." "I am," I replied. She glanced confidently toward the county crew. "I assume they'll confirm what we've known all along." I simply nodded. Daniel didn't acknowledge either of us. He opened a clipboard, read the survey authorization aloud, then turned to his team. "Locate the original Northeast monument." Within minutes, the robotic total station was tracking prism poles while GPS antennas collected satellite data. Laser measurements bounced silently across the property. No arguments. No opinions. Just numbers. The first monument was uncovered exactly where Daniel expected. The second confirmed the original bearing. The third eliminated any remaining doubt. By the time they reached the fourth marker beneath the largest white oak, a crowd of nearly 40 neighbors had gathered near the sidewalk. Children sat on bicycles. Retirees shaded their eyes. Even delivery drivers slowed down as they passed. The air felt strangely quiet. No chainsaws. No lawn mowers. Only the occasional electronic beep from the survey equipment. Daniel brushed dirt away from the final brass monument before stepping back. The lead county surveyor entered several measurements into a handheld data collector. Everyone waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. Then the printer mounted inside the survey truck began producing paper. The surveyor reviewed the calculations once. Then again. Finally, he turned toward the group. "The original monuments are intact." Linda folded her arms. "Exactly." He looked at her calmly. "And they established the legal property boundary." Her smile remained. For another 2 seconds. Then he unfolded the freshly printed field sketch. "The HOA reference line is incorrect." Silence. He continued. "The actual boundary extends approximately 8.1 feet east of the current HOA landscaping." Nobody moved. I watched Linda blink. Just once. As if she'd misheard him. The surveyor wasn't finished. The decorative stone entrance, irrigation system, flower beds, community lighting, and approximately 147 feet of maintained greenbelt have all been constructed on Mr. Walker's recorded property. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Someone actually gasped. Linda stepped forward. "That's impossible." The surveyor handed her the field sketch. "The monuments determine the boundary." She stared at the drawing without speaking. Daniel quietly unfolded my father's original survey beside the new one. The lines matched almost perfectly, 26 years apart. Different technology. Same answer. The breeze stirred the leaves overhead, sending sunlight dancing across the old white oaks. For decades, those trees had silently marked a line no one bothered to verify. Now they stood as witnesses while every assumption the HOA had built collapsed beneath a handful of brass monuments hidden just inches below the soil. And for the first time since this all began, I realized the survey itself wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching the truth become impossible for anyone to argue with. Justice didn't arrive with flashing lights. It arrived in certified mail. 10 days after the survey, a county-reviewed boundary report was delivered to every party involved. The measurements were final. The original monuments had been verified. The legal description matched the deed my grandfather received decades before Willow Creek Estates existed. There were no gray areas left. Only consequences. The HOA's attorney requested a closed-door meeting before the end of the week. For the first time since this all started, Linda Brooks wasn't sitting at the head of the conference table. She sat quietly along the side wall, a thick folder resting unopened in her lap. The confidence that had once filled every room she entered had disappeared. The association's attorney did most of the talking. He cleared his throat before sliding several documents toward me. "The board has voted to accept the county survey as controlling." I nodded but said nothing. He continued. "The HOA will immediately suspend all violation notices issued regarding your trees." Another page. "The association will remove all landscaping, irrigation lines, decorative lighting, and signage installed within your property boundary." Another. "All accumulated fines have been permanently withdrawn." Then came the final document. "The HOA is prepared to reimburse your legal and survey expenses as part of a settlement agreement." Silence settled over the room. I looked toward Linda. She never met my eyes. Instead, she stared at the same table where she'd once insisted my grandfather's trees belonged to the neighborhood. Funny how facts can shrink a person's voice. Over the next month, the subdivision looked very different. Contractors returned. Not with chainsaws, with shovels. The decorative stone entrance closest to my property disappeared first. Then the flower beds. Then the irrigation pipes that had quietly crossed onto my land years earlier. Even the elegant black light posts were removed one by one, leaving neat circles of fresh soil behind. Every morning, I watched crews undo what assumptions had built. Neighbors stopped to ask questions. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Others admitted they'd never realized an HOA could be wrong. Mrs. Carter smiled as workers loaded another section of decorative fencing onto a trailer. I guess the trees knew where the line was all along. They always did, I answered. A few weeks later, another neighborhood meeting was held. This one was unusually short. Linda Brooks resigned as HOA president. No dramatic speech. No excuses. Just a brief statement thanking everyone for the opportunity to serve. Someone else was elected before the evening was over. Life moved on. That's what neighborhoods do. As for me, I never built a taller fence. I never installed security cameras facing the street. I never put up angry signs warning people to stay away. Instead, I spent one Saturday morning doing something my grandfather would have appreciated. I cleaned each original brass survey monument, one by one, carefully brushing away years of dirt until the stamped numbers shined in the sunlight again. Near the largest white oak, I placed a simple cedar post no higher than my waist. Attached to it was a small bronze plaque. It didn't mention lawsuits, or surveys, or the HOA. It simply read, Original Property Monument, established 1979. Visitors probably think it's just another historical marker. I know better. Every time the wind moves through those white oak branches, I remember my father's letter waiting inside that old basement safe. Never argue over opinions. Find the monuments. He was right. People believed maps. People believed newsletters. People believed the loudest voice in the room. But the truth had been waiting quietly beneath a few inches of soil the entire time. Those trees were never protecting the property line. They were protecting the story. And in the end, the story didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to the family who planted the first tree, trusted the ground more than rumors, and understood that real justice never has to shout. It only has to stand exactly where it has always been.